Yeah, like in a horrifying way.
Alright, so I also am a little bit of a Star Wars geek. Actually, I haven't seen into this one yet. Don't ask me why. For shame. For shame. My best friend's seen it 3 times. I hate him. But anyhow, anyway, so this is a little pun, and we're going to be talking a little bit about metaphors, and it's very apropos for me to take this as a topic, being in cognitive science, because, or as a student also involved in cognitive science, because 2 of the most prominent theorists and researchers in contemporary cognitive science have argued that metaphor is at the root of all cognition, or of all thought processes, that most all of our knowledge of epistemological orientations are metaphorically rooted. So I'm going to talk about several metaphors regarding one particular topic, and that topic is going to be theories of mind. So for the next 30 to 15 minutes, I think, I'll be talking about diverse theories of mind from the humanities, from the sciences, give a brief little bit of history, explications of some of their ins and outs, and talk a little bit about some of the particular implications or consequences of adopting particular theories of mind. So that's the topic. The general orientation throughout this, I'm going to be adopting and try to remain as much as possible within a process philosophy orientation, process metaphysics, and that's very important that we understand the distinction between process philosophy and substance philosophy, or process metaphysics and substance metaphysics. The most simple example I can give you, you probably all had this in basic chemistry or biology or physics, where they talk about the wave-particle theory of light, but it's neither a particle nor a wave, but it's both. And you can pinpoint it and freeze it in time, and it appears as a particle, but in reality it's always a process, and therefore it's a wave as well. The basic premise in the sentence is that everything is in constant flux. This idea can be traced back to ancient India, with the most prominent Buddhist philosopher since the Buddha, named Nagarjuna, who is referred to as the second Buddhist. He said everything is in constant flux and process and change. There are no essences. I'm sorry for questions about humanity, but there are no such essences. This can also be seen in Western philosophy. Heraclitus and the ancient Greeks said famous quote, "You'll never twice step into the same river, because you won't be the same nor will the river." So topics, theories of mind, orientations, process philosophy, and the methodology. This makes it sound much more highfalutin than it really is. Most of these are implicit, but you can read them there: historical, comparative, sociological, philosophical, neuroscientific. So all of these will be brought into the context of the discussion at some point or another. These questions here, I just kind of threw them up there to have some orienting questions as well. They're not really things I'm necessarily going to be focusing on, but they are very relevant questions, and they're questions that I get faced with a lot. I actually had 2 Jehovah's Witnesses come to my door today about 2 o'clock, 2:30 before I was coming here. That was the first thing they asked me. I said, once they found out what I studied and what I was doing here, I said, well, I'm religious studies and cognitive science. They said, well, how is that possible? Reconcilable? Like, how can you believe in God and be a scientist at the same time? And I was like, well, both of those questions are bad questions. But that's the broad and specific introduction. I started, I guess, at 4:30, so I'll try to get up around 5. Maybe I don't want to take too long. I don't like talking all the time. So that's the general introduction. I guess actually I will talk about this briefly. This second sub-question, I suppose, does design imply designer? That's going to be a major thing, and well, there's one particular paradigm that I'm eventually going to hone in on. I'm going to narrow it down into one particular theoretical approach, and then dive into that a little bit, and then show how that's relevant to a whole host of methodological approaches within the humanities. But this question about design imply designer, it's been shown readily, and I'll give some examples later of how you can have incredible, almost incalculable complexity arise without any sort of design or pre-program whatsoever. Spontaneous emergence of self-organizations, a theory called synergetics, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll get into that. I do believe the sciences and the humanities are compatible. I believe that the humanities were the original sciences, going back from a historical perspective. This question about a grand unifying theory, they call it GUD physics. They're always looking for a GUD. The question is, does that even desirable thing? I also believe it is. I don't know how else we're going to bridge the gap between the sciences and humanities without such a framework that can discourse at all the different levels of analysis that we engage in within academia. So, my Western bias here. 4 theories of mind. We're familiar with all of these. so I won't dwell much on any of them. I hope it's big enough. I tried to find, I'd never done this in a presentation where I became picture-oriented. I usually don't even use PowerPoint, I like to just have conversations. So this whole PowerPoint's going to get a lot of pictures, and I kind of use them as mnemonics to guide me in the topics and kind of freestyle a little bit. But I try to find things that are cute. So, you know, a little shot. You know, you can see that that's the government, press is the fire, the public, and they're watching the puppet show or whatever. But that's Plato. He says that mind and body are a little bit different. The mind doesn't necessarily perceive reality as it is, that we see these shadows on the wall, and that we're not seeing the real forms. I don't think Plato actually used the word forms, but it's been totally attached to him. And it's a concise way of describing his idea. So that was a few centuries before the turn of the so-called Common Era. Descartes, 15, 16 centuries later, whatever it was, said, I think, therefore I am. Incredibly redundant circular argumentation, especially from someone who is a mathematician and a logician, to come up with something like that as a central premise for the mind is a little bewildering to me. Riddled with holes, but it bears into this basic kind of duality that you're going to see in the top three here, how they all kind of distinguish the mind from the body a little bit. When we're talking about why, from my perspective and the perspective of the theorists I study in cognitive science, that's a major asset. Freud, we know, has this iceberg metaphor of the mind, where the consciousness, the conscious aspect of mind itself is literally the tip of the iceberg, and that the vast majority of cognitive processing that goes on at a subconscious level. Subconscious is also problematic terminology. And we can think also about, just in the back of our minds, about how each of these different paradigms, the Platonic, the Cartesian, Freudian, have engendered certain types of research paradigms. And I'll take a brief segue to talk about Freudian, the implications of a Freudian theory of mind. In the 1950s and 60s, when autism was first kind of coined, it was coined a little bit earlier than that, but anyhow, it first became a little bit of a thing. It blew up in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, but one of the original ideological conclusions about the source of autism was refrigerator mothers. They were lousy mothers, and so they blamed children for this. And they were taking this kind of Freudian paradigm of these, I was about to say primordial, because very early infantile, early experiences with the mother particularly are incredibly and irrevocably almost informative and, transformative to what that child will become. So when these kids are having autism, they call them refrigerator mothers and took mothers out of households, or took the kids out and put them in mothers. That's a problem. That's a very serious political, social issue that's predicated simply upon the theory of mind, how the mind develops. Some very bad downsides to some of these that we don't think about readily. This last guy down here, one of the coolest people I've ever read about, his name is Hofstadter. And he argues that mind and body are completely the same, that cognition is spread throughout the body. It's not bound within the skull. The skin actually extends outside of the body, that you all are a part of my cognitive process. That we're working together, because that expression altered my heart rate a little bit, because I had to try to figure out why you're doing it. So therefore you are part of my system. How do I really differentiate that in my third level? Distance and time we can, but I can't think the same because you're here, so you literally are part of my experience of reality. But this picture here, this kind of little picture here is showing the way he perceives as the self is he describes it as a strange loop. And he uses a lot of mathematical metaphors. But he says that that what the mind is literally a way of representing our potential ways of interacting with the world. It's a very pragmatic orientation. The mind is not something abstract from the body. It's not distinct from the body. It emerges and grows with the body. It is determined to some extent by the body. And what the mind always thinks about are these potential ways of interacting with the world. So you have your hand, but you're going to be here, 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 here. And you have somewhat of this infinity of options, but it's a very limited type of infinity that expression can be forgiven. So he says the mind is something about that. It's the body learning how to interact with the world, and every time it develops more skill and interacts, hopefully more efficiently. I said that was going to be brief, that wasn't. Next slide. 3 more theories of mind. These are the ones that you're probably not familiar with. These are all from the cognitive science department. No, this is the department. Cognitive science can be traced back to the late 1800s. We've all heard of phrenology based on the shape against the separate skull. You have certain personality traits. That was an early attempt at performing what we would today call cognitive science. But there's generally 3 waves within the history of cognitive science, and I'll cover these all in 90 seconds or less. Each one of these terms correlates with each one of these pictures. It's deliberate. The sizes are different because each one poses a grander perspective of mind. So this is the cognitivist or computationalist. You might think this picture will match up better when I describe it. Essentially, they conceive of the mind as a computer or as an information processing system operating over binary, using binary operations and algorithmic kind of processes, but literally it was input-output. You know, press the letter J comes up on the screen. It's very, very basic, right? The problem with the cognitivist perspective is that it can't explain or account for the complexity of human behavior. Why is it that you and I will see the same roads when we touch the I-1, right? So it doesn't take in embodied history. It doesn't take in a lot of different things into account, right? We all have the same physiological machinery, give or take extremely minor differences, but we perceive the world sort of radically different. So this metaphor is largely abandoned, but it's still there. This is the connectionist network, and the connectionist approach was a way to try to nuance or improve the basic cognitivist or computationalist theory. They just basically said this: listen, the brain works these multiple series. There's tons of series of parallel. They call it PDP, parallel distributed processing. So, say you and I are looking at one thing, but we're also at the moment right before that. That can account for a little bit of differences. So, you know, different types of processes that are going on at the same time can account for differences in perception. It was basically just a little bit of a buffed up version of this. But it was still based on that same input-output thing. You still perceive the same thing as what was going on at the other time. You could modify that in a slight way. But it's still not very dynamic. And so, right apropos, the third phase that we're in now is the embodied dynamic systems approach that says kind of what Nagarjuna said, that Buddhist philosopher, that everything is inextricably interconnected and interrelated. Everything affects everything. So my heart rate affects my blood flow, which affects the oxygen in my brain, which might affect a certain chemical distribution within my brain, which might affect the way I'm speaking, which affects my posture, which in turn affects all these other things. So there's this constant circular reciprocal causality going on. It's a very Buddhist idea. It's actually being modeled now mathematically in artificial and natural systems. So that's a brief history of cognitive science. Those are three theories of mine, and we can talk about the political implications of those, but I don't think anybody much of I don't much to talk about. By the way, please interrupt me at any point in time, because I'm so happy to have any kind of break from speaking at any point in time. If you disagree or like it or anything, please speak up. I'm more than happy to stop. Go.
So the dynamic systems, this understanding of everything is interconnected. So we've changed, so you show how here it is, it's changed over time. Will it ever change out of the dynamic systems, or does that seem to be the paradigm that's gonna like last for the next 200, 300 years?
My personal opinion or the consensus in the scientific community?
Whichever you're willing to go.
They're in agreement. I think the general agreement is that Stephen Hawking has espoused this. There's a lot of faith that the nonlinear differential equations and the way that they can model state change over time in any system, any model of complexity, or any level of phenomena. That is the grand utility of it. So there's a lot of hope that dynamic systems theory will be the gut, because it can model phenomena at any level, from the sociological to the neurological, to the molecular, to the submolecular, all the way to the cosmological. It's the only mathematical framework that can describe accurately transitions in these phenomena at every level. I'm convinced of it. It seems useful to me. That's why I've completely changed my entire course with academia. It's changed everything. It's the only theory I've actually been convinced of, because it's the one that has a mathematical basis. It can ground and unify everything else. Every other theory I've seen has had to butt up against something else. Dynamic systems theory doesn't butt up against anything, such stuff that doesn't line up with the empirical evidence. We're going to make a little transition here. I'm going to fly through some of these slides. I've got like 38. Some of them will be on for 10 seconds. Some of them will be on for, God, I hope not 10 minutes. But we've all heard this story, right? You take somebody blind and you put them around an elephant and you say, what are we dealing with? Well, it's often the case that we have people in different departments that are studying very similar sets of phenomena. We don't quite realize that. They come to different conclusions, and of course there are different, intellectual, political, social, economic, historical, ecological conclusions and implications of these different approaches. So we need interdisciplinary, we need people to be talking to each other across boundaries. I would like to think that can just be taken as a given. I wouldn't have to argue with that. More on interdisciplinarity, a couple of easy stuff, right? We can read that. First one's extremely self-explanatory. The one on the left, I suppose if that's the first one. All raised in the West, so we read left to right. On the right-hand side, though, the second one, technology and liberal arts going in different directions. That's the problem that I have. I don't think that it's necessarily that needs to be the case. I think it's disgusting to the extent that it is the case. And I wish more people were motivated trying to find ways to actually bridge gaps. I know there's reasons for having kind of a Manichaean system where departments are separated, but I don't think that means necessarily that there has to be any kind of source of cocoon between them. The problem is finding a type of theoretical apparatus that allows people in different departments to engage with each other fluidly, and that's what I think the utility of the dynamic systems theory is. So again, that's another answer to your question. Popular misconceptions of religion and science. There's no space after the ampersand. We're all religious studies, so we know how ridiculously shallow popular conceptions of religion are in particular. There were some that were extremely offensive. I think the one on the left is pretty offensive. If it's not, I don't know what you can do in this part, but it's really offensive. But there's not much that needs to be said about that. But we do need to have a greater publicity for what we do across the academia and out in the world, because it never ceases to fail that I meet people and think I'm doing theology. And a lot of people in this department say we are, and that's a really good argument too. That's a nod to my old friend Josh. And this other guy named Seth, who was really hostile to what we did here. He was a smart guy. Some more misconceptions. This is a big one for me. I find this topic of reductionism brought up constantly in articles that talk about the field that I kind of consider myself in, which is cognitive science of religion. First thing I would do to fix this, the overlaps often are much greater than what we show here. I would argue that also it should be in a circle, that the physics does touch the culture, right? Because physics and technology, Dr. Robb talks about S with structure, economic, social, political, intellectual, technological, and historical. So the physics that we can use to create telephones changes privacy, changes rules of morality, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say it needs to be a circle, and the overlaps often need to be heavier. That's the first minor complaint I have. The major complaint I have is that if you go this way to the left on this model, that you're becoming more reductionist, and if you go farther to the right, you're becoming, I don't know where they come up with this term, expansionism. I don't like it. Reductionism goes on in every academic discipline. It's generally the case that you don't accept an answer or an explanation or something if they don't involve some kind of reduction, right? It's kind of like the status quo of explanation. That's what kind of explanation is. You break it down to its system components. If you break the system down to its components, then you understand why it works, how it works. So religion is myth, ritual, sacred, for instance. I don't know that religion has justified true belief or strong belief is necessarily a great definition, but I think it kind of stays at the same level. But reductionism goes on everywhere. Theologians reduce the Bible to its components and differently. So it goes on everywhere. So that's the second major problem I have with that. There's all these critiques about reductionism, and I'll come back to this one point, but I'll make one sentence about it now. It's that the biggest critique that I get from these ladies that come to my house today, from people that I talk to, is that if you're doing science, you're demeaning religion. And I don't think that anything could possibly be farther from the truth, because it typically is the case that when we apply scientific analysis or reductionist analysis, anything, we recognize that it's much more complex and beautiful than we thought it was before. Flower is a much more significant thing that appears to be. Love and relationships between people is much more significant and complex than it appears to be. A lot going on behind the curtain. So, there are real world problems. Again, I tried to be cute. So, interdisciplinary skills, right? Big problem if you read a lot of scientific literature is that they're often horrible writers. I'm not a great writer, so I'm not saying that from a perspective of superiority. I'm just saying that I read a lot, and I feel like I recognize good writing when I see it. Most of those kind of do. There's a general consensus that some authors are better, easier to read, more fun to read. Science writing is typically boring as hell. And oftentimes when scientific speakers, people in science are speaking in public at TED Talks or whatever, they speak in ways that humanities scholars would have a lot of problems with because they're a little clumsy, but they're verbal sometimes. They don't recognize certain implications or the depth of meaning of certain terms that they bandy about willy-nilly. Richard Dawkins is the greatest example of this. The Four Horsemen of New Atheism, their discussions of religion is infantile or puerile at best, often. Sometimes it's insightful, but they would benefit rather than taking a few classes with us. I have a problem with this picture down here, and it goes back to the reductionism thing. So this is the kind of interdisciplinary model I like, where everybody kind of has an equal role, and it all kind of factors into the ultimate equation. There's an implicit problem with this one right here, and it brings up, I never touched this before, there's an implicit problem with this, and it's the problem that I think people in humanities generally have when somebody wants to be really, truly interdisciplinary and bring a scientific discipline or really outsider discipline into some other discipline. They're sitting at the table, you could say, whatever, sociology, psychology, history, English, literature, political science, business, whatever. But the puzzle piece is all blue, and I think the general idea is that, oh, well, the blue guy is STEM, right? They get all the money, they get all the power, and this is their blue puzzle, they're putting it together, and it's like, yeah, y'all have pieces to contribute, but like, no, only we're gonna get it. So I don't like this model there just because of that color thing. I don't really know if that was even what we're talking about, but when I saw it, I was like, I like that, because I think, when a lot of people talk about interdisciplinarity, that's what they think it is. They're trying to get, people are trying to scientize religious studies or science of the humanities, and I don't really think that's necessarily the case. I think we're trying to deepen humanities and elevate the sciences, and that's the kind of interdisciplinary program that I have in mind, and that a lot of people that are much more eloquent than I do have in mind. So that's that. I think the next slide is another transition. Oh, no, it's more on reductionism. Simple point here, mostly focus on the cake. We could look at that too. I'm not going to get into that. I had rehearsed this presentation once and I stuttered like crazy over that, so I'm probably just going to skip it. Please ask questions or something. This right here just simply shows that every academic orientation we have plays an important role in understanding the relevance and significance of any phenomenon. I don't necessarily know that I like this vertical level, although being rooted in the humanities, I like the fact that we're kind of at the top. But you could flip that hierarchy and it's just as valid either way. But the point is, every department has a valid contribution that none should be necessarily isolated. And again, the big thing I want to do is try to find language that can unify all of these, and that's what a lot of people think dynamic systems theory can do. It might be the next great false hope, but it seems like a good chance right now. The basic point with this is to kind of go back to process philosophy, essentially. This would be a substance metaphysic. This would be a process metaphysic. So the nonlinear math that we do looks at changes and transitions over time. The old math looks at things in a frozen moment. So here's where we react to that. So this is kind of dealing with essentialism, right? Plato was an essentialist, said there's an ideal cat. Buddha would say there's no ideal cat, there's just cats. And we have to learn how to deal with each one individually. But science generally says, oh, well, you have these conditions, we'll give you this pill. And that's kind of a problem that's based in the substance metaphysics or non-process metaphysics. That's all I'm going to say about that. I didn't get through it well once. Okay, here's a transition I thought was coming. So, there are, to me, interesting set of parallels. Is it 20 minutes? I'm just checking a little bit. An interesting set of parallels between religious studies and cognitive science that I found over the last 2 years. And I'll take a quick note to kiss off to Dr. Robinson for a moment for allowing me to take an extra course above and beyond the 2 I was supposed to only take to get credit towards the MA degree here. I should have taken the third one. So that was very nice. But I found some interesting parallels between religious studies and cognitive science. And even though there's 3 phases in cognitive science, are broken down to 2 because they can generally be scratched into 2. And this is a big, this is a big problem in religious studies. I call this classical thought, but enlightenment model thought and postmodern thought. So structuralist, post-structuralist is a bad way to say it, but it kind of gets at it. But enlightenment said there's an objective truth. It's like the objective-subjective dichotomy, right? In the way we typically stereotype science today, religion gets stereotyped, science also gets stereotyped. People often criticize scientists for having a lot of hubris or being arrogant, thinking they know things are objective truth. Like, nobody knows more than the scientists, so they don't think that. Even with mountains of evidence, they generally don't really believe propositions. It's the worst caricature ever of science. But there is this subjective-objective problem, right? Where in enlightenment model thought, we have an objective sense of reality, we understand it, we can control it, manipulate it, etc. Postmodern thought says, no, everything's in flux, everything is in transition. So again, you have substance metaphysics and process metaphysics. The problem with this one is it objectifies things, therefore certain classes, races, genders, etc. are valued differentially. In postmodernism, we have no real rubric for evaluating any of them, and that can create a sort of kind of nihilism or meaninglessness, right? We're all kind of familiar with that. Postmodern malaise is a popular way to talk about it. In cognitive science, we have the same thing. Computationalist approach, that objectivist approach, the embodiment approach is very subjective. There's no real normative standard. I duplicated the slide to give pictures to show it. Enlightenment model thought about symmetries was very heavily emphasized symmetry in the study of reality. I have a great book on that. That was kind of the objectivist thought. And then postmodernism kind of like this hall of mirrors, right? It's just a representation of a representation. What representation is foundational? That's a problem, right? Because then you have no real base for meaning, and every meaning you have is contingent. That's existentially frustrating. Camus thought that was horribly existentially frustrating over time. Computationalism, the same thing. This picture is actually really cool. I'm not going to get into why it's a horrible representation of that, but I love the picture. It talks about how the self emerges from all of these biochemical processes. But that's the objectivist thing, digitized computer. The embodied cognition says, well, the body is just a tool that we work with in the world, just like any other animal's tool. We share 99.99999% of the same DNA and everything. We all just interact with the world. We just interact with it in a more complex way because of the way that our neurology is structured. But the same kind of problem. So there's these two major parallels between religious studies and cognitive science, and most everyone this debate between objectivism, subjectivism, dualities. And so, what's next? So this goes back to my idea about trying to have a unifying language. All these different cultures have a chain of being, right? And I found hundreds of these. I've narrowed it down to I think 4. There's Aristotle's, there's a Chinese Buddhist one, here's a Christian one, which is strikingly similar to early representations of Darwinism, strikingly similar. Only difference is there's no God, and there's a God here, but God's man in the Christian sense, so maybe it's not that. But striking similarities, but that's again a caricature of Darwinism. This would be a much more accurate representation of the Darwinist account of where we are. I don't know if you can read that. Archaea, Eukarya, Prokaryotes, single multiple-celled organisms, and each one scaffolds off of this, if you notice. It's kind of hard to see, but everything scaffolds off that one. We're somewhere up there, or just one dot. And yet our population is going from 57 billion in less than 200 years. Not very great, ecologically speaking. So is humanity a good thing? I would answer that question like, historically, ecologically, we're the most horrible thing that's ever happened to the planet. Camus, again. Anyhow, this is something I mentioned earlier, so this is justification for human hubris. The biggest thing that differentiates us is the differentiation within our cerebral cortex. Most animals have an almost undifferentiated brain, just to put it bluntly. We have sulci and sulci within sulci and gyri within sulci, which are basically creases, which literally increases the surface area of the brain. Most of your brain is not actually brain cells, it's connective tissue. The only part of you that actually does any thinking is a tiny little space, I think it's like 6 millimeters of cerebral cortex that covers the underlying areas, the gray matter. And ours has become, it just keeps growing. It's almost like an anomaly. The human race, it just gets, and so that's why it gets increased and pressurized and it's folding in on itself so it can create more surface area. If it's stretched taut, it's thin, but if you can kind of scrunch it up, you can get more, you know. So there's that kind of thing, but that's what basically gives us, you know, like ego, it's like, yeah, I'm smarter than everything else. But we're still just one of many, but that's what creates the difference, is our ability to be more complex, to interact with the world more in more complex and intricate ways. That's the basic difference. We're operating with the exact same machinery, the same protons, neurons, electrons, chemicals as your dog and cat, and as the chairs you're sitting on in a large way. It's just the way that it's organized. And this one, Chain of Being. That's my favorite one. And I don't know if anybody else notices this. I said this to my girlfriend earlier, and she's like, "You're crazy. That looks like a Darwin fish." Really not. That looks like a school of fish. I don't know. Well, that was an implicit bow to the evolution within the Lion King. Maybe I'm crazy. She's like, "You're crazy." I'm like, I don't know. I see a Darwin fish. It's like a Jesus fish, but now it's a Darwin fish. They put little legs on it, you know. Anywho, that's it. So, to answer Josh's question, how do we bridge this discursive between us in like 25 minutes? And an existence theory might be the way to do it. Point the slide. So cognitive science of religion is something that most of us are unfamiliar with. We typically do humanities-based religious studies, but there is a long tradition of using science more strictly defined by what we think of science today to study religion. And one thing I've noticed in a lot of cognitive scientific literature, we had a guy that graduated here, McCorkle, I believe, Zach Wright, he graduated here, has a book up on the shelf now. Outstanding text.
It was that he taught here.
Yeah.
He was, I think it might have been an undergrad.
Really? I thought he was a student at some point. Great book. Completely omits Nietzsche, which I find disgusting. And I'll talk about that for some reasons why. But the problem with a lot of the cognitive science of religion, even though it seems to be the most cutting edge way of studying religion, I say cutting edge in the sense that they use MRIs, et cetera, this kind of stuff. There's a lot of implicit Platonism. There's an implicit substance metaphysic. And that's problematic. So to give you an example, one of the most, and this is just so ridiculous, one of the most well-known theorists in cognitive science of religion is named Pascal Boyer. And Boyer says, well, he tries to answer the question of why religions are kind of everywhere. And he describes religion as, cognitive science of religion takes as an a priori statement that we're a unified species and we share similar cognitive biological mechanisms. and all of our religious traditions, their variations are predicated upon that same foundational mechanism. But he comes up with this incredibly brilliant, I'm being sarcastic as possible, this incredibly stupid idea that the reason why humans everywhere, or so many places, seem to have this belief in God is simply because we have a God module in the brain. And I'm like, well, congratulations. Like, you just made up something that any fourth grader could have made up. You don't cite any neurological evidence for it. You've got a whole book on it without a trace of neurological evidence. It's kind of disgusting the fact this guy got published with the most ridiculous idea. He calls it a hyperactive agency detector, a HAD. And he roots it, the only evidence that he has for it is it says, well, if you're living in a primitive world, it's much more useful to identify, to run at false positives. So if you hear rustling in the bush, just run. If there's nothing there, it's just the wind, you're safe. And if there was a lion, you might still be safe, right? And so he says that we've been because we have this HAD, which doesn't locate anywhere in the brain's physiology. He says because we have this HAD, we impute agency to everything. And that's the origin of God beliefs. And I'm like, yeah, that's pathetic. But a lot of cognitive science religion stuff is kind of like that, and I could go on and cite more examples of it. But there are some people in the cognitive science of religion that are actually doing stuff that I find to be classifiable in what we would understand as science. And this is a more rigorous emphasis on the body thing, not just taking it as a toy to use and kind of use as a catchword to get published. Some people, for instance, have taken a lot of research from cognitive science, so this is called the Tucker and Ellis task. And the reason for this being useful is the following. Most of us are right-handed. I'll take it for granted that we're all right-handed here. So when you see these pictures and they're shadowed out, and these are pictures where you can kind of tell that it's a water picture, but when they show these people, it's usually a silhouette. And they'll find that people will more readily identify this as a picture if it's rotated to the right. The reason being is because we would typically grab a picture with our right hand. If you have it rotated to the left, we don't typically use our left hand. It takes the brain more time to process those. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of examples that show that the way that our bodies interact with the world play a major role, have a major impact on and play a major role in the way that we recognize things at a perceptual, intellectual level. There's infinite research on this. Infinite. So there's all these examples of that. That's just the easiest, that's the one that can explain you most quick. I probably got about 25 articles on this type of thing. We'll talk about, I'll give you a couple other examples real quick, because I see people laughing like that's not really good. So like another example is they always have these ideas of good being up and bad being low, right? Typically better as a human, be more upright, getting taller and so forth. People are taller have different types of advantages. And there's this differentiation that these one authors make. One of the best articles I found, they make some very necessary distinctions that they call the test theory of cognition. It's tropic, embodied, and situated theory of cognition. So you have the tropic, which is fundamental that we all share. We all have the same organs. The embodied is the way that we're particularly embodied, whether you're male or female, tall or short, et cetera, et cetera. And then situated is whether you're sitting in this classroom, whether you're sitting in the bathroom, et cetera, right? And all these things play different roles. And so they go through and decide different examples from each of these. So the example of good being up and bad being down is almost completely universal. It's a favorite experiment of mine. And you can do this here if you go home and ask this to somebody. Try this test. Where you go home and you say, just think of something you got to be looking dead at. And you say, think of something good, uplifting, positive, lovely, encouraging. And 9 times out of 10, the person will typically look up and to the right, especially if they're right-handed. If you say, think of something bad, devilish, evil, et cetera, people will typically look down to the left. There's also a lot of literature showing that people typically are lying when they're looking down to the left. There's a lot of associations with that because it's bad. So these are anecdotal things, but when you start mounting up all these different types of things, it starts to make kind of a coherent argument. I spent way more time on that, and I was very offensive towards some of the cognitive science and religion stuff. I was really enamored with it. It's kind of like a disillusion. I was really enamored by it when I first found it, and I started reading deeper. I was like, wow, this isn't very good. So this is what I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking on. These graphs will live for a very long time in history. The experiment lasts forever. And I'm going to show you a 2-minute video. I've described this briefly when I gave my first presentation. Horrible when I gave very much information. Watch this video. I pray God for this work. It's 2 minutes. It's got a little baby. It's cute. It's fun. Oh, it's not going to work. It is thinking. It's not thinking hard enough. I'll try it. This is called the A-not-B task. It's about infant perseverative reaching. And Piaget talked about this in a way that typically between 10 to 12 months, infants develop what's known as an object concept, where they can have a mental representation of things out in the world. We can now say that there's no need for any kind of such mental representation to explain. there's no such need of any mental representation to account for infants' behavior, and their argument that no such mental type representation is necessary to account for higher, more complex forms of behavior either. So watch this video, I'll make it big. It's kind of fun. I might get commentary. So.
There's a lion.
So it's a tantalizing option for the kid, right? The kid immediately forgets it's there because he's young, right? But,
There's that lion.
you know, so we'll repeat this for a couple of tries, and there's going to be a crucial trial where they switch it up, and I'll point that when it comes up. The kid obviously loves his little toy. It's a tantalizing toy. This is a 10-month-old, by the way, below the age threshold where they typically fit.
Thank you. Here he goes.
And out of sight, out of mind, like peekaboo.
There's that lion.
No, it might have seemed as though he pushed the curtain aside indeliberately, but we'll see in a moment that it actually was a deliberate movement of the curtain.
Is he jumping? Okay, can I see Mr. Lion? Thank you. Here he goes.
Now see what they did? She put it under B. It's B spot instead of A. This was called A, not B. What does the kid do? It watched it be placed in B, but it still reaches to A, the first spot. Piaget said the child doesn't have an object concept yet.
Here's this lion.
It doesn't have a permanent mental representation of what's going on.
Okay, can I see Mr. Lion? Yes, here, please. Thank you.
It's tired of giving it back.
Mr. Lion.
See, it definitely watched it going into B. And it's like, what is wrong with this kid? Right? I think that's the end of the video.
Here he is. Here, this is Lion.
So that reaching to the wrong spot is called a perseverative reaching error.
On the bus.
A ton of literature on this, endless literature on this. And this goes into the thing about theories of mind, how we think about the mind fuels research. So Piaget said, I think your friend that was sitting here earlier, Cheyenne, talked about developmental stages. Dynamic systems theorists don't really much buy into developmental stages unless they're physiological structural stages. There's no mental stages like Piaget had 4. Vygotsky had other sets of numbers. But the significance of this is shown in this graph, and I didn't bring the one thing I need. It was a great 3-sentence explanation of this. So I'm gonna try to wing this. I'll do it in 30 seconds. If I fail, I'm sorry. So this is the A trial and the B trial. The child sees the object, tantalizing object being placed in A. That creates a spike in neuronal activation. We can model where this is going on in the brain. We see the spike. This is time this way. Okay, so time is moving that way. So it's up, it sees it. Oh, that's really cool. It's really cool, right? And that graph stops. So over here you have time, and the child is seeing. And we can actually look and see the neurons firing in the occipital lobe, the basal ganglia, superior colliculus, and all these regions of the brain that are associated with vision. And we can see they're highly active. That's the object being placed on the B trial. Then the child is, the thing is moved towards the child where it can reach it, but yet you see motor activity reaching back to A. And it's like, well, why? So Piaget said there's no such thing, there's no object concept, there's no mental representation. Dynamical systems theory says the mind is just the body interacting with the world. It's not some abstract dualistic thing. It's processed with the body. It's bound in time. It's moving through time-space. So the reason why the child still reaches to A is because there's still a memory trace, and this graph doesn't really show that, but other graphs will show, but there's a memory trace, a muscular memory trace for reaching back to there. So what's happening is when a child's born, they're obviously not very coordinated. They can't reach out and deftly, dexterously manipulate objects. They fumble, they bumble, they stumble. They don't have the muscular to walk, but they don't have the coordination to walk even if they did. You lay them on their back and their legs will wobble, but they're not coordinated. So what development means is to have development of coordination and skill over time. So what has to happen is different muscular sensory networks have to become mapped onto each other. Until that happens, you don't have mind. As you have these networks, these muscular perceptual networks, all these systems, being mapped onto each other in a real-world activity being constrained and channeled. You have kind of what Watson calls the behaviors where you become constrained and channeled to operate, not predetermined ways, but systematic, or what's the word, statistically average ways. I'm going to fly through the rest of this because I'm already 10 minutes long. So they talk about habits as being attractor basins. This is probably the most useful one for showing it. We've all seen pictures of like space-time and Einstein type stuff in the space, right? So these are habits, and when something starts rolling, approaches a certain subset of, if I react towards you in a certain way that you're sensitive to, right, that's an attractor basin, and then every other sensory perception could fall into that, right? So it's like, if your mom walked in here bleeding, all of a sudden everything else will become irrelevant. That's an extremely strong attractor basin. There's tons of ways of modeling this. This is just showing how the brain becomes wired. When you're born, you have way more neuronal connections, cellular interconnections in the brain than these. They're literally pruned down. You don't develop new pathways, you prune away unused pathways. So you become what your environment kind of constrains and channels you to be. So this is just showing that all these dynamics, these small patterns, can become more complex and interwoven until eventually you have something like the appearance of a self, right? You become more clearly a distinct person over time as you have these patterns being mapped onto each other, these sensory motor patterns. All kinds of cool ways to map these attractors and to show these computer simulations, fluid simulations. We can see if the model butterfly's wings, these same type of attractors explain galaxy formations in the cosmos. This is a really cool thing. The same theoretical language can describe phenomena at the massive astrophysical level, cosmological level, all the way down to butterflies, and it explains things at the submolecular level as well. So it's a quite useful permeable language. So perceptual emergence, I don't even know why I have these slides in here, I'm sorry, but it basically kind of just goes to reinforce that we're trained to detect patterns. We have patterned ways of perceiving things. You'll almost instinctively see the dog in a tree. Why? Because you're trained to look for certain sets of correspondences in reality. That's what the mind does. It's just trained to do that. The Necker cube, this is called a reversible figure. It's the case that you almost can't focus on it just being flowing downward to the left. Occasionally your focus will shift it back up and to the right where it's coming at you that way. That's because of burnout in the cells. They can only be active for so long. So you have literally, because of the constraints of the firing capacities of cells, you have certain types of pattern perceptions arising as well. Usually takes people a second to figure out why that cube is messed up. But it's not hard to figure out, and M.C. Escher is famous for playing with this type of very simple optical illusion. This one is a fun one. You can make the snakes not rotate if you focus your eyes on one spot. But you will find that it's very difficult to focus your eyes on one spot for more than a few seconds because your cells in your retina burn out. You can only look at something for so long, so your eyes are constantly shifting several times every second, every millisecond actually. Your eyes are never in one spot. That's how it creates a computer sense of reality. It's actually a digital phenomenon, patterns. So emergence, I'm going to finish up in 5 minutes. The definition is the temporary and seemingly spontaneous coming into being of new patterns and forms in a system. That's a problematic definitional term, system, but as a result of the self-organizing interactions among the components that comprise the system. Dawkins is famous for saying this: of all the animals that exist on the world, it's not even like a fraction of a millionth of 1% of all that could have existed, right? There are so many failed lives. Think about every strawberry with how many seeds, how many of those seeds actually become a new strawberry, right? So it's very rare that something actually gets to emerge into a life that we have, so we're incredibly blessed to even be existing. And this just shows how organization occurs basically through proximity and distance, and anyhow, I don't know if I can explain it. You can probably kind of see that, how certain areas just become more dense just because of the way they're arranged. So you can have self-organization in natural systems without any kind of design, and incredible complexity with very little design. It's pretty well known now that genetics play a major but not complete and entire role in what you become. There's a well-studied phenomenon called epigenetics now. Nutrition is the clearest example. If you don't feed a kid right, it will become dumb, small, etc. Cytonode bifurcation. This is where I make some quick connections. This is my favorite type of bifurcation. It has parallels in the humanities, and particularly Pierre Bourdieu and Peter Berger, two of my favorite theorists. Thank you, Dr. McLeod. Where basically the trace of the original input is lost, and it becomes subsumed into larger patterns. This is parallel in religious studies, and I don't know why I have this slide here, but without any prescription or reason or rhyme, you have incredible, intricate types of differences arise in snowflakes through these self-organizing processes, the emergence of higher forms through basic, very minute interactions. The settlement bifurcations where you lose the trace of the original input, it just becomes woven into everything else. And Peter Berger talks about this as objectivation or mystification. There's lots of other parallels in some theorists we might know, like Vygotsky. I know Josh knows Vygotsky. But objectivation and mystification, basically the processes where aspects of the world are taken as a given. You just assume certain things, right? That's a settlement bifurcation where it no longer has to be processed. It's just automatic. It's automatic. Bourdieu talks about this habitus field and doxa, where these are the systems of dispositions and so forth that just kind of seem self-apparent, right? We can model these mathematically. Picard, who's a really cool guy, that's a school I would like to go to in Pennsylvania, but I won't. This guy comes up with this thing of, he integrates all the stuff I've been talking about to account for normative emergence. How do you have normativity come about in a world where everything is kind of just meaningless interactive particles, right? He says through these self-organizing properties, you have normativity emerge, right? Because patterns emerge, patterns constrain other patterns. Certain patterns are more productive to other things and so forth. So he goes on and on about how different types of mental representation, so he builds from that A not B model to much higher forms of cognition. He's partners with this other guy named McCoffin Johnson, and thank God for Dr. Robinson again for letting me get money for books. Shows how the way that the body is structured can actually account for all the different types of advanced forms of mathematics, all the way up to the top, are basically metaphors based on bodily experience. It's very cool stuff. Circular reciprocal causality, I'm not going to dwell on it. It's that Nagarjunian Buddhist idea where everything getting interconnected. So again, we're coming back to the process philosophy where wrapping things up in full circle. It's somewhat intentional. I weight tables. I think you weight tables or have weighted tables. So we know that when you walk up to a table, there's a whole lot more going on than meets the eye. The way you respond to me or react to me, whether you're breathing in or exhaling when I approach the table completely changes the way I approach you. I'm never inhaling when I approach the table because that changes the whole dynamic. I have to always be exhaling. It makes people more relaxed because if you're exhaling, you're less likely to be. But if you're breathing in, you have potential energy stores. There's all these incredibly intricate dynamics that go on to waiting tables. So there's a lot more going on. We get a good server, please God to them, because they know what they're doing. They're looking at everything. This is this is you. This is the environment. Constant feedback. The environment's always changing. You're changing in these different ways. That's that. There's problems with the way this is drawn out. That's the same thing. Where is the beginning, right? It's all kind of tied in together, so everything's in process together.
You have about 2 minutes.
That's great. That's my last slide. So I want to read 2 things. Dr. Britnell asked me here, I forget what the context of the conversation was, but he asked me, he said, why should anyone care that you can use math to explain these phenomena? What's the point? And like, why would I use math to read Nietzsche? I can just read Nietzsche. And when he first asked me that question, I was like, what a ridiculous question. Like, all we do is read other authors, the ones of other authors, and by thinking about phenomena in the context of other authors, that's how we originate phenomena, is by metaphorical analysis, right? I can use Durkheim to analyze this. So first I thought it was a ridiculous question. But then I shared that with my girlfriend. She's like, God, you're such an ass. Like, you can't give anybody the benefit of the doubt for asking me a good question. And I was like, well, no, I guess not. Like, why? And she said, well, like, just think about it. Like, just sit and think about it. It's a good question. I said, okay, so I'll do that. And what happened is I came up with a bunch of good answers. I'll share one. I have it right here.
In a minute and a half.
Okay, what happened was it redeemed Nietzsche for me. Most people think that Nietzsche's a pessimist, that he's a nihilist. If you read the beginning of Will to Power, he actually shows a pessimism and nihilism, following the line of Peter Berger, who actually wrote 50, 80 years after him, said that religion actually had bred science, which bred the pessimism, right? So he was trying to actually redeem life from the death of God. Reading him through the lens of dynamic systems theory and everything as patterns, I started noticing that dynamic systems theory completely lined up with this idea of Will to Power, as everything being this kind of just boiling series of patterns and process. So now, I'm gonna read this. So I was gonna read 2 things I'm not. This guy says that the most complicated philosophical problem you'll ever have to learn to deal with is that of your own embodiment. So I'll leave it at that. He said it in a very beautiful and poetic way, but I don't have time. But one thing I learned about Nietzsche is, by reading through DST, is that he basically made the world a much more valuable and beautiful place than we ever thought it was. So in line with dynamical systems theory, he says that in the total course of things, nothing exists in isolation. The smallest things bear upon the greatest. And everything that happens is inextricably knotted to everything that will happen. Every framework, extended processes are not separated. Dynamic systems theory emphasizes that in human development, every neural event, every reach, every smile, and every social encounter sets the stage for the next and real-time causal force behind change. because development can only be the long-time accrual of changes occurred in milliseconds to milliseconds and second-to-second events. So my final 2 sentences, I'm sorry if I go a few seconds over. So in Nietzschean dynamic systems theory, our purely physical world is both apparently and actually imbued with meaning through human activity that transcends the immanence of the moment. So Nietzsche says, you must not be hostile or indifferent to existence, rather you must be affirmative of it. He writes that very few are clear as to what the standpoint of desirability, every thus it should be, but is not, or even every thus it should have been comprises. These statements comprise a condemnation of the total course of things. So, in drawing a conclusion regarding the inextricability and causal relatedness of all events, Nietzsche summarizes his own position. The world might be far more valuable than we used to believe. We must see through the naivety of our ideals and recognize that while we thought that we accorded it the highest interpretation, we may not have even given our human existence an even moderately fair value. So to skeptics who then declare they don't know what they're doing or should do, Nietzsche writes, you're right, but make no mistake about it, you're being done moment by every moment. Therefore, I won't read the rest of it, but it says we should become the poets of our lives in the smallest and most commonplace matters first of all, art as a purpose of life.
Thank you. I'll have to ask you to stop.